My maternal grandparents, Baird and Hogg, may have been Scottish, but I'm English. Scotland is a foreign country, strange, often beguiling. It is so foreign because of its very familiarity.
We're all acquainted with the heritage racket, tartan and bagpipes.
Why do they do it? Why does Seen It All A&E personnel from Auckland, emeritus petrol pump attendants from Council Bluffs, cartilage-splattered abattoir operatives from Manitoba, butch sous chefs from Wagga Wagga, hard-cottaging marine mechanics from the Tigray Delta, leather-skinned coiffeurs from Port Moresby, cynical lawyers from Boston?
Why do they do it? Why do they come to Scotland in search of their ancestors, who are no more than mere names? They pore over all but illegible faded copperplate in parish registers, with scant regard for the damage inflicted on their eyes.
They scrape the lichen from headstones.
They walk beside burns where someone with rickets, who 2 centuries ago happened to share 100% of their mother's surname and 1.575% of their DNA, might, just might, have walked in inadequate footwear beside that sheep's ancestor. What's the matter with them? What is this obsession with roots? And why is Scotland world leader in the roots caper?
Why Scotland? Because Scotland's chief export, like the Basque provinces, like the Auvergnes, like the Campagnas, has always been people. Brain, muscle, cannon fodder. Powerful Scots send humbler Scots to die in distant countries. People leave in search of a living wage, a better life, the chance of material improvement. It's largely a matter of economic survival, partly, too, of the desire to seek a bigger stage. Scotland has seldom been able to provide for all of its people, so they make a hard-nosed decision to leave.
And their descendants make the soft-nosed decision to come back, to coet the quaintness, and to delude themselves that they're somehow connected to the place. The stuff in their veins is blood group MAC. When they bleed tartan blood.
Scotland's tourist industry naturally encourages this genealogical inquiry. Indeed, Scottish tourism is founded on the obsession with burrowing for old bones. This year is the year of something called homecoming, a summer-long orgy of golf, whiskey, tartan, cabers, kilts, pipes. A parallel world of cliché, pure corn, fabrication and income. The internet has been a great boon to fans of pornography and to amateur genealogists. One pursuit will make you go blind. The other will merely boost sales of super-strength Kleenex man-sized New Labour expenses wipes. The principle of pornography is incremental. There must always be more participants, more contortions. The same applies to genealogy. The past has a past, has a past, has a past. It's not enough to stop when you've discovered your great-great-great-great-grandmother's birth certificate. You have to find her mother, and her father, and her father's 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 christening mug with the dent from the Big Bang. It's a sort of addiction.
Best never to get started, for at the very heart of this dismal enterprise lies a sort of recessive communitarianism, an ancient tribalism, a literal backwardness. We demean ourselves if we define ourselves by the community that we supposedly belong to, whether that alleged community is determined by religion, skin colour, regional accent, political persuasion, football club allegiance, or any other criterion.
And in tracking down our ancestors, we're simply subscribing to another way of defining ourselves by group or clan. We are creating a new file, a new enclosure, a new separateness. We're also kidding ourselves, telling ourselves a lie of the old days. We have the good fortune to speak a language which, unlike Arabic or Sicilian, has a future tense.
My maternal great-grandparents were both born and brought up in this Stirling suburb, St Ninians. My mother spent childhood holidays with their extended families in the neighbouring boroughs of Dunblane and Bridge of Allen, whose grand villas they cannot possibly have aspired to.
She and her sister had to sleep in a button bed, a niche next to the oven. It was an arrangement akin to that used by Kazakhs and Turkmenis, who placed pallet-like constructions over ovens. This ad hoc bucolic alcove would come to be formalised as a built-in feature of many Glasgow tenements.
Guinness, McAllister, Taylor,
Baird, McInnes, McAllister, Taylor. I know my forebears' names, but they don't touch me. The former Stirling High School was a work of James McLaren, who died in his mid-30s, leaving behind a mere handful of exquisite buildings. They are much more interesting to me than tiresome tales of the Taylor brothers' elaborate ruses to prevent their parents discovering their chronic truancy.
The Wallace Monument's archivist is unable to confirm that my great-great-grandfather was its first keeper. That, however, was what my mother told me. Keeper means caretaker, janitor, hardly then a boast that anyone would bother to make up. So I guess it's true if unproven. That frail familial link does not dissuade me from the conviction that this astounding structure commemorates a murderous medieval terrorist. It is the supreme architectural emblem of Scotland's dodgily fabricated past. Brute force in the service of gross sentimentality and mawkish victimhood.
The lavish heredities that homecomers weave for themselves are as predictable as tartan and as bogus as Highland Games. They perpetuate the myth of a land as sloppily counterfeit as Merry England, a land that hardly was, a dead land, a millstone, all those Bairds and Taylors, McInneses and McAllisters stretching back to elemental mulch.
There are other Scotlands, vital, living, untarnished by Walter Scottishness. Places of the strangest energy and greatest delight. Time for a rebirth. Places that have no ancestral claim on us, where the yoke of a ready-made collective history is absent, which we can talk of in the future perfect rather than the past historic. Places that we can elect to go towards rather than come from. Places which are potential, where anything is possible, where everything is waiting to happen. There are places that we choose to attach ourselves to, or which choose us, whose genius loci is so potent that it incites us to love them. The spirit of the place renders us incapable of resistance. That spirit is not spiritual. It is rather a combination of geological, meteorological, and man-made circumstances. It's the enveloping presence, the essence, which incites sensations of transcendence, awe, and bliss. These sensations do not depend on the exhortations and boasts of some intercessionary deity, of a wrathful worm god slithering through the Eustachian tube to demand oblations for having worked to create this paradise. This is the world's work of countless millions of years against which we measure ourselves and are found wanting. Passes through and all that. A blink in the eye of eons. Here, at the northwesternmost periphery of Europe, is what feels like a presage of the future, the distant future, the furthest future, after which there'll be no future at all. This is the island of Rust, known too as Lewis and Harris. It is a blueprint, a working model of the day which will have no tomorrow. It's an island of countless mysteries, enduring mysteries. The light is singular, constantly changing. The island is porous, like petrified sponge. Its landscape is not landscape. It is liquid. Its waterscape is not waterscape. It is solid. There are areas of glacial erosion and of sedimentary transportation. The metamorphic gneiss is 3,000 million years old. It is the result of several deformations. It is the oldest rock in Scotland, if this is Scotland, which I doubt. Obviously, it's administratively Scotland, but otherwise? During the last ice age, the alternate pressures of freezing and thawing, expansion and contraction, combined with erosion to turn what had been monolithic into a moraine of millions of loose boulders.
In Hindu mythology, similar rockscapes were formed by monkey gods, bad-tempered and evidently very strong brothers, frenziedly hurling boulders at each other. On the Isle of Rust, there are no fratricidal monkey gods. No. Calvinistic Presbyterian mythology, which claims to be something other than mythology, decrees that this island, boulders, locks and all, was created by God, the one God, in 6 days.
Fair enough. We all know the lad's got a great engine on him. He's 100% work rate, a celestial Scalzi. But what if God's day is anyone else's couple of million years? What if his conception of clock time and calendars does not correspond to the mundane artifices invented by emperors, popes, and Swiss watchmakers?
The quaint misattribution of the island's provenance, the denial of fact in favour of creation myth should not bother us. For the wonders of evolution are far more subtle and far more fascinating than the coarse fabrications of those repositories of ignorance called sacred texts. forgivable 2,000 years ago as a means of trying to understand our physical environment, but quite inexcusable today.
Maca, pretty much peculiar to the Atlantic coast, is a work of millions of years of sand and crushed shells being blown and swept onto acidic peat. This creates a thin but exceptionally fertile soil, which is further enriched by guano of ground-nesting birds, oyster catchers, sandpipers, terns, lapwings, redshanks, corncrakes, peewits, and by grazing cattle's dung. Does this mean that cattle are coprophagic? Let us dwell rather on orchids, clovers, daisies, and on the dunes between the sea and the Macaire, where marram grass grows, a sort of armature, a set of reinforcing rods that inhibits the shift of sand. Peat is dug and dried for slow-burning fuel. It is host to many heathers. Peat occurs in exceptionally wet, temperate or cold climates where vegetable matter, notably non-flowering plants such as sphagnum moss, is prevented from totally decomposing by an excess of water. Certain species of sphagnum have spore capsules which shrink to the point where the air within them is so compressed that they explode noisily. This may partially account for the belief, the literal belief, that peat moors are inhabited by the boisterous bog sprites who infect so much twilit Celtic folklore. Peat used to roast barley famously lends the whisky made from that malt an operating theatre bouquet. When taken in sufficient quantity, that liquor can doubtless convince the most obdurately rational mind that green creatures dance by night on the desolate moors. These creatures, some amiable, some malevolent, some the spirits of the dead, some fallen from heaven, were thought to inhabit unseen places beneath the earth and under pools, which would be revealed as the world ended. Because of a lack of oxygen and an abundance of acids, peat preserves animal bodies and human bodies, the bodies of those who have stumbled into its bogs and those who have been murdered or executed. The ligature or noose will often be preserved too. The process is closer to pickling than to mummification.
Some 2,000 such bodies have been discovered in Jutland, Cheshire, County Meath, Groningen in the northern Netherlands, and Varberg in Sweden, but none has yet been found on the Isle of Rust.
The likely reason for this is that the topography is inimical to the industrialized peat cutting which has so far revealed most of the bodies. But we can go on hoping.
These bogs are full of future potential. It's not inconceivable that a device which can detect the limbs of the dead beneath several meters of peat is in an advanced state of development. So we'll be able to meet our ancestors by design rather than by the chance of a plough or harrow. And even if we can't meet them in the flesh, we'll be able to meet them in the leather. So much more satisfying than reading a name on a birth certificate.
I'm not a juvenile delinquent.
No, no.
There are golden eagles in the mountains, soaring no doubt, and buzzards drifting on thermals looking to transform a harmless mammal into lunch. White-tailed sea eagles, whose wingspan is over 8 feet, 2.5 meters, patrol the coast. They live on fish, with a bit of carrion on the side. There is little competition for prey with golden eagles, who eat rabbit, hare, grouse, which makes them unpopular with gamekeepers and hunters. There are ospreys, hen harriers, which are white-bellied buzzards, peregrine falcons, kestrels, shags, fulmars, who can eject an oil reeking of putrefying fish from their stomach to fend off attackers. This oil swiftly solidifies to a sort of wax, which can be incapacitating. Beside them, hoodie crows who merely pluck out the eyes of lambs seem paragons of moderation.
It should be noted that all of these species are sociopathic recidivists, murderous delinquents well into their maturity. They are thus very bad role models for any youngsters who may be watching.
They may inhabit paradise, but they make it hell for their prey. There are deer everywhere. Deer don't fly, save in France, where a kite is called a flying stag, un cerf-volant. There are hare, rabbits, otters, bottlenose dolphins, seals, basking sharks that are allegedly harmless, though it's hardly worth the risk of finding out. There are slow worms, midges, horseflies called clegs, but there are no snakes.
So the ancient belief that Barvis Moor was the Garden of Eden must be incorrect, unless, that is, the snake, as maligned as Judas and as necessary to the story, emigrated after it had performed its vital task.
No doubt some of the many other claimants to Edenhood, the source of the Tigris, the spring in Jerusalem and so on, are more climatically plausible, and of course they are in the Middle East, font of all monotheistic mumbo-jumbo. But are any of them as primal, as primitive, as truly paradisiac as this elemental moor, whose name in Scottish Gaelic is Baravas, like that of the outlaw or terrorist whom the mob had necessarily to wish pardoned in order that it be Jesus who died? It is more Calvary than Eden, abattoir rather than cradle. This is the northwestern extremity of Europe. It prompts wonder. It prompted wonder and bewilderment to our distant pre-literate forebears. And it prompted, too, the urge to investigate and measure what was around them. They had no recourse to the supernatural. They calibrated their place in their surroundings by marking the actual, where the sun sets at the vernal equinox, where it rises at the summer solstice, the positions of constellations, the vagaries of the moon. This was practical. This was the first germ of what would become science. Curiosity sated by investigation, rather than by crude hypotheses. These sites may have been calendars of a sort. It's likely that they were also places of celebration.
Celebration is not the same as worship. The presence of ritual, which appeals to a certain cast of mind with a fondness for occluded dramas and ancient conspiracies, cannot be confirmed. Nor, however, can it be denied. But it's worth noting that whilst these stones are 5,000 years old, Wicca, Druidism and paganism are little more than 300 years old, and many ancient rituals derived from polytechnics in the 1970s and 80s.
Jalabin ancient in the Wicca agus Chania leon. Bueno broche glirschen agus toes num pakanoch. Christian count wa on the rouse och gjoles net dreien. Should they out sich me as an trespli on nacken on the rying ne kelchish.
It was also in the 1970s that Celtic folk rock established itself here, in Ireland, in Brittany and in Galicia, a cleverly marketed form of pop music which depended on nationalistic sentimentalism, on a sense of victimhood, on the Celtic world's conviction of its secessionist destiny, and above all, on an antipathy to the primacy of the English language, the French language and the Castilian language. The entire package was about as based in historical certainty as Tartan and Ossian's epic, which isn't to say that bogusness does not have a reality of its own.
The nature of these sites' funerary roles and their uses as commemorative cemeteries is moot. The presumption that henges and menhirs and dolmens are sacred is based more in the interpretative and speculative biases of the early modern age, which first concerned itself with such phenomena, than in irrefutable evidence. The ascription of fancifully conceived primitive belief systems to our ancestors is wrong-headed. The contention that the religious instinct was paramount in all peoples and in all epochs is taken for granted, which is a good reason to question it.
Why should ancient man have been any different from us? Some of us are credulous, more are not. In any society where there is no cultural coercion or political obligation, we believe or do not believe according to our conscience and our intellect.
It's patronizing and ahistorical to assume, as neo-Celtic musicians appear to, that the ancient Celtic world was monocultural. Some sites may have been sacred, others secular. What is indisputable about these sites is that they tell us that mankind is a maker. That is what is paramount. They do not tell us why they were made, and we shall never know for sure.
Given a few pebbles and an idle moment, many of us will position them in lines or grade them according to size or form elementary shapes with them. This might be diagnosed as symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is not what it was called several millennia ago.
Mankind obsessively devises patterns. Maybe these sites have no meaning. They're patterns made for their own sake or for the sake of controlling their environment. Maybe they're pre-Euclidean exercises in creating a non-representational kind of art, specifically what we know as land art, an art based in the collection and regimentation of local materials which happen, in the case of gneiss or granite or Wiltshire's sarsen stones, to be durable. There may have been thousands of kindred sites constructed in areas of friable material, chalk or sandstone or gritstone or wood, sites which have not come down to us because they eroded or rotted, leaving no trace. Our knowledge is dependent on geological chance. The most circumstantially persuasive argument for these Neolithic sites being sacred rather than the result of collective OCD is their very location, which is topographically extreme, climatically extreme.
It's in such exaggerated places that religions are born, and it's where they flourish. Desert, steppes, tundra, mountains, salt flats, aridity, permafrost. These are propitious conditions for the descent into hallucinatory reason that is dignified by the name of faith.
The more extreme the landscape and climate, the greater their effects on the inhabitants. Temperate climes are, happily, less effective cradles of what David Hume called sick men's dreams. On the other hand, they do promote the greatest of human virtues: skepticism, cynicism in its true sense, and doubt. The Isle of Rust is entirely atypical of the UK as it is today. There are 50 churches, one for every 400 people in a population of 22,000. Over a third of those people attend a church every Sunday, a vastly larger proportion than anywhere else in Britain. Though it must be noted too that 2/3 of the population is non-observant. This church at Rodel is the most impressive medieval building on Rust, but it would be nothing special elsewhere in North Britain. It's the exception that proves the rule of the island's church's unfailing banality and unfailing dreariness. The idea that a church might be visually enjoyable is alien to Calvinism. Enjoyment?
Whilst Presbyterian sects are forever diverging over doctrinal nuances which are invisible to the lay observer, they're united in their contempt for the pursuit of beauty. The Jezebel architecture is a papist strumpet. Icons are sacrilegious. Music is the devil's work. Ritual is theatre, which is an abomination. The idea of delighting the eye is an offence against modesty.
These insipid buildings incite us to lead a life in fear of life. They're the very obverse of the great stone circles, which are hymns to mankind.
I wanna Sunday kind of love.
Unlike, say, Anglicanism, Calvinism demands commitment. It's a matter of conviction and unconditional acquiescence. It affects the way its adherents lead their constrained life. Even though it is today a minority pathology just, it still attempts to create a cultural tyranny and to impose its morals and wacky brand of tolerance on the majority, who can think for itself. The most evident manifestation of the sacred's contamination of the secular is on Sundays, the Lord's Day, the Sabbath. Even though, despite the clamorous subjections of the minority, a Sunday ferry now sails, the island closes down. Work of any sort is disapproved of, but so is leisure. Don't tend your garden. Don't go for a walk. Don't listen to music. Don't go fishing. Don't swim. Don't. Prescribe this, prohibit that. The cause may be delusional credulousness, but it results in the greatest of modern luxuries. Silence, calm, something close to serenity. It causes us to realize that there is a secular case for Sabbatarianism, for, anyway, a day that is different, not necessarily Sunday. A day when there is nowhere to lout about at lunchtime, to chant in the afternoon, to get into a stramash, to buy pointless things in an atmosphere where your ears hurt because of drivelling pop noise and your nose hurts because of burger stench. It is, of course, conceivable that the Sabbath is uncomplainingly observed because so much of the population is in no condition to do anything but slump after the previous evening's Nordic exertions. Our race's most widespread means of escapism are religious faith and insensate intoxication. For a totally satisfactory result, combine the two in the manner of dervishes, berserkers, and shamans. Oh, they certainly know how to escape themselves. Until the beginning of this decade, all alcohol was imported. In 2001, Andrew Ribbons established the Hebridean Brewery. And last year, Marco Taban set up the Aveen Jarek Distillery, the Red River Distillery. Apt, if belated, for whiskey, ushkave is the only Gaelic word most of the world knows. Gaelic, in this instance, has nothing to do with France. This island has Scotland's largest concentration of Gaelic speakers. If, that is, one discounts Glasgow's Gaelic-speaking ghetto of Gaelic language media dimensioning operatives, Gaelic language propagation strategists, Gaelic language participation leaders, Gaelic language education vanguard light managers. The self-important socio-linguistic industry is, of course, risible, but the language it supports most certainly isn't. That only 60,000 people speak it is no reason to allow it to wither on the tongue. The fact that it might be more practical to allow the English language to vanquish it is of no moment. Practicality is an infirm criterion. Think of Gaelic as a threatened system of cultural ecology, or compare it to a species nearing extinction, or a spirituous liquor which might disappear because the recipe was lost, as in a way it was. There is much that is peculiar to Rust.
Gugger, for instance, gannet. Every August, 10 men make a hazardous 40-mile journey to the uninhabited island of Sulla-Scare. They spend a fortnight there, trapping and then salting gannet chicks. This was once alimentary necessity. The meat apparently tastes like chicken fed on fish meal. I'm going to give it a miss, just as I gave fermented trout a miss.
I wish I'd given whale a miss, but I was only 3, at a picnic on a Dorset beach.
I am wailing, very soft, mum, to the sea.
It would have been discourteous to refuse the lumps of grey gelatinous meat beneath an undercooked pastry crust. It was like chewing in a razor.
Harpoon sharpen, did cotton bees win?
This whaling station was operational from 1904 till a few years after the Second World War. Whales were processed for ambergris, for oil and wax, and for margarine, which explains a lot. The meat, cheap, plentiful, and pleasant, was a staple part of the islanders' diet. A lot of food is still produced here, but much of it is beyond the inhabitants' means. Scallops, lobster, crayfish, mussels, and so on. But not salmon, which is so intensively farmed that its price has plummeted along with its quality. The locks are factories. And like factories, they manifest what might be called an industrial style. Though that's pushing it a bit. Sub-utilitarian is more like it. Herrings and salmon are kippered. Salmon is also cold smoked and cured as gravlax. Highland cattle, Crowdy cheese, beef, sheep, lamb, hogget, wether, tweed, not a food. MacLeod and MacLeod, Charles MacLeod, W.J. MacDonald, A.N.R. Morrison, A. France. All of these butchers make the best, the truly original, the most authentic Stornoway black pudding, Maracou. It is the peer of the best Blutwurst, Boudin Noir, and Mothia. It can sit at the top table and hold its own.
This toy fortress was designed in 1848 for Sir James Matheson. It's in a style that a plutocrat might have chosen 25 years earlier, long before Victoria's accession. Which isn't surprising, for Matheson had been out east all of that time. He was a trader, which is to say he was a drug dealer on a heroic scale, which Columbia's finest can only look on with envious wonder.
This God-fearing teetotaler bought the entire island with a fortune made from transporting opium from India to China and from promoting addictive dependence in tens of thousands of people in southern China.
It was on behalf of Matheson and his fellow dealers when they were expelled by the Chinese government that Britain waged the ignominious Opium Wars. Matheson should have been imprisoned. Instead, he received a baronetcy, and like many criminals before and since, was elected to Parliament, whereupon he proposed that a grim lump of rock to the north of here called Rona should be turned into a high-security prison.
He built his castle on the site of the island's only distillery, thus encouraging the use of illicit stills.
Whilst the castle, despite its size, is rather trivial, its remarkable grounds demonstrate that parks, aviaries, zoos and arboreta were, despite their association with the Enlightenment's propagation of knowledge, founded by men trying to play at God, trying to mimic what was still widely considered to be his creation. They belong sentimentally to an age before reason.
Or at least to an age before humility and reason told man that he was no more capable of controlling the world than a god had been of having created it. In Matheson's native Northern Highlands, the clearances of crofters had been undertaken by landowners and clan chiefs in what they believed, or at least deluded themselves, was a spirit of philanthropic noblesse oblige. The so-called improvements were as much a project of Enlightenment pedagogy as of agrarian capitalism. People who subsisted in insanitary bothies, burrows and caves were forcibly removed from the land which hardly yielded them a living.
You're 1,000 miles away, but I still have your love to remember you by. Oh, my darling.
Some were provided with houses, jobs and education in the new grid plan fisher towns of the Sutherland and Caithness coasts. Some were transported across the Atlantic. The moors they had inhabited were made over to sheep.
On my knees every day.
By the mid-19th century, all philanthropic pretense had been abandoned. Matheson proceeded to treat the islanders, his islanders, with the same sensitivity that he had displayed in Canton, though they were not provided with the balmy solace of narcosis. Nor did he build a fisher town. In the early years of the 1850s, almost 2,000 inhabitants were forcibly expatriated, mostly to Canada, their passage paid by Matheson. The suppression of whiskey had been calculated. The suppression of Gaelic was, in part, a clumsy consequence of this involuntary diaspora. What Matheson did do was build roads. They provided work during the famine years of the 1840s. He intended that they should be used to carry peat so that it might be transformed into tar. The scheme was a non-starter. On the mainland, such roads came to be known as destitution roads because they were built by the destitute, and it was along them that the indigent marched away from destitution to their uncertain future on the other side of the world. The name is prescient. Today they often lead to a different sort of destitution. Whatever wealth is generated is mostly well concealed. It is very seldom manifest in the built environment. And when it is, there are some works of architectural merit on the island. Well, a few. And they seem impertinently pretentious measured against the startlingly abject norm. This is perhaps the only place in the world whose townships and villagescapes, urbanism and landscapes are wholly infected by the Calvinist mentality. That is, by a blindness to prettification, by an aesthetic bereavement so absolute that it is a sort of insouciant anti-aesthetic. In a way, the everyday buildings are the very contrary of Matheson's. They suggest that to compete with this most magnificent terrain would be both hubristic and certain failure, so they simply didn't bother to compete. The unsurpassable strangeness of the island resides in the chasmic gulf between the naturally evolved and the negligently created, between scarp and scrap, between the sublime and the substandard. Not that the natural is invariably natural. It generally isn't. The landscape most formed by man here is not that of menhirs and dolmens. In fact, man is moot in this context.
This corrugated pattern of drainage furrows, runs, and of fertile ridges, rigs, is mostly in desuetude, but it's so widespread that it's one of the defining characteristics of the landscape. These systems, like stone circles, possess the kind of abstract integrity that often attaches to the purely practical.
The steadings and small holdings too are purely practical. But where the field systems are ordered, the buildings are extraordinarily chaotic.
The island shackscape is the apogee of the Northern Hebridean anti-aesthetic. Members of the National Trust and of kindred bastions of insipid taste will no doubt fail to acknowledge the fantastical beauty of what is here. They should be pitied and soothed with Glam's tea towels.
These scapes are beautiful in the way that a lupus is beautiful, or mold on fruit, or decaying meat, or scar tissue, or amputations, or diseases of the skin, or anatomical freaks. They exert the same pull.
This is the great outdoors, as it might be imagined by hothouse poets of the darkest indoors, by masters of polymorphous perversion, Francis Bacon, Arthur Tress, Joel Pierre Whitkin, Félicien Ropp. This is everything that planning can never achieve, art born of artlessness and carelessness. It's as though man hurled temporary structures and machinery in the way that the old gods hurled boulders.
It is a thrilling environment, made by a beguiling lack of respect for that most sacred of cows, the environment. Worthy, green, dull, and tiresomely backward-looking. Put a petrol head in a pedestrian precinct, and you'll get a fascinating crash. And once the entropic template was established, it was repeated with endless amendments and in countless permutations. There is nothing that cannot be used as an ad hoc folly, as a felicity beacon, as an iconically iconic icon. And there is apparently no one on the island who is immune to the appeal of the found object and the oxidizing object. Whoever would have thought that the last remaining bastion of fundamentalist Calvinism would become the site of a scrap cult? And that the most seductive collective expression of Gallic vernacular culture would comprise buses in bushes, crumbling pickups, corrugated iron, more corrugated iron. Whoever would have thought? We should think again. This island nation, this rather enchanted island, is a law unto itself. De jure, it belongs to Scotland. De facto, it belongs to itself. It's a tartan-free zone. Far from being stuck in the Scottish past, it presages the not very distant future when continents and nations and regions and towns and villages split into ever smaller fragments according to their language, their patois, their schismatic religion, their wacko culture, and their peripherality.
It suffers exemplary conditions to succour the 21st century's gradual isolation and subsequent atomization.
It does indeed foster a minority culture which has the strength of its self-consciousness. Its language is a means of communication, but it is equally a cause, spoken by very few people. It is abnormally religiously observant. Other nations and nation-states will catch up. It will come to seem normal. This is the Wi-Fi wilderness, when the Wi-Fi is not climatically disrupted. Like poor crofters and weavers before them, its inhabitants are discovering the hell that is home working. Offices, labs, studios and canteens are social places. There are no canteens in the wilderness. There are no snoutcasts gathered outside a door shivering into their gaspers. Other extremities of this continent spell out their situation. Finistère, Land's End. Rust may stay stum about it. But this is the end of the world, the old world, and the beginning of a new one. How long before we succumb to the woolly temptresses on the moor who shamelessly go naked even on the Sabbath? How long can we survive being trapped in a virtual cage? That is a bit of a mystery. There are, however, much greater mysteries to dwell on. How do you get a Ford Transit into the middle of a peat bog? I'm not expecting an answer to that. Nor to,
How do you get a mini metro in the middle of a peat bog and turn it upside down? These vehicles will gradually become enveloped in sphagnum moss. Several millennia hence, in a world ignorant of internal combustion, they will be rediscovered in a state of partial preservation, and they will be revered as sacred objects of a distant pre-apocalyptic age, a paradisiac age which ended with a bleat and a stuttering carburetor.
The Isle of Rust was played by Lewis Harris.